please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Welcome to this very important conversation on issue that has vexed many societies and governments around the world. By way of opening remarks, let me just try and give you my thought on what we are trying to discuss today. I think in this digital age, we are fundamentally negotiating 4 new contracts. I think the social contract of the 19th century are up for revision. When we talk about the data policies, data protection bills, and security, surveillance, capitalism, etc., we are essentially now negotiating a new arrangement between the state and the industry. And how do you manage this particular relationship? The industry and the users. What is the fundamental ethic that should drive this particular engagement? The government and the citizens. And what are the new levers of responsibilities and controls? And finally, the user and the citizen, as we can now see that users themselves are becoming organizers and drivers of social media outcomes. So whether it's the horrible cases of certain mediums being used to create violence and disturbances, or to create aggregations that can create positive change, we are seeing the users and citizens create their own engagement. So I think this new social arrangement, this new social contract is really what we are discussing. We have an interesting panel to discuss all of this. We have Rahul Mathan, who has been writing, and he's a new book out on this particular subject. He's a lawyer who understands this whole sector quite intimately. We have Argo Sengupta, who has been driving this Indian proposition. The Shri Krishna committee member, as well as the person who has personally invested a lot of time for India to put forward a sensible framework. We have Rob Sherman, who is suffering in Europe, suffering in California, and now will suffer in India, and he will tell us whether the suffering is the same or different. We have Mr. Gopalakrishnan, who will finally sign what Orgo has been agitating in the committee, although he says no, but he's part of the government. And let's say that his ministry has been the principal actor in putting forward this proposition that we are discussing and debating today, and eventually it will be discussed in Parliament as well. And finally, we have the former NSA of the United States, General Hayden, who has, in many ways, as I was telling my panelists, a curious distinction of being an NSA who wanted encryption, who was comfortable with going dark, who was not necessarily so interested in having back doors, windows, and front doors, because he intrinsically understood the sanctity of the system is retained when the system remains, has a degree of integrity. So, Mr. Hayden, let me start with you, General Hayden. Coming from where you do, is security a false flag to redesign some of the systems that should primarily serve innovation and personal rights in spaces? And coming from the country that you do you think we have, A, not been able to create a system that offers the same levels of legal protections to all citizens across the world? The US does well to protect its own citizens, but doesn't do so well to protect me. My data is up for grabs. The US citizen is protected. And 2, the US has not done very well in being able to create data exchange agreements with countries, which has led to a certain degree of pushback around data localization, around countries coming up with their own legal frameworks, and perhaps the GDPR and the Indian protection bill, data protection bill, have that degree of cynicism around US policy as well.
If I bring up the question of the San Bernardino terrorist killings about 2 years ago, maybe a little bit more, recall terrible killing, dozens killed, and then a great fight over a cell phone as to whether or not the FBI should direct Apple to bust through the iOS in order to read the data on the phone. It seemed to be a clear question of security and privacy. It might surprise you that me and a whole bunch of Americans like me, and by like me, I mean really like me, former directors of the National Security Agency, sided with Apple, sided with the company against law enforcement, not out of privacy rights, The individual who owned the phone was dead. He didn't have any privacy rights. And not out of business concerns, we didn't have interest in the success of Apple. In this incredibly complex world, we sided with Apple in a way that seemed non-instinctive to most Americans out of raw security concerns. That the new definition of security would actually have you protecting the individual's privacy, as opposed to allowing the government to do something which was for a good purpose, but would make everyone in the country's digital security worse off than it would otherwise be.
You didn't respond to one particular question I'd asked you, that do you think that US could have done more in terms of allowing access, lawful access to data, and certainly for certain geographies that they believe to be allies, friends, partners, etc.?
In order to undercut the argument that data should be localized because the Americans are more dangerous than anyone else, we're not. Actually, we're probably more constrained than anyone else, but that argument was a very useful one to be made when the real purpose was to enable local industries competing against American companies.
Thank you, General Layton. Argo, General has explained quite clearly what the drivers, at least from sitting where he does, are for devising any arrangement to manage this particular key question. While with the committee, and of course now you're out, the committee's job is over, what were our drivers? Were we seeking better law enforcement frameworks? Were we trying to have better governance and efficiency and the big state acting more effectively? Were we seeking to protect the individual privacy and rights? What were the key drivers for the debate while you were in that committee?
When a country like India comes in at this stage and thinks about privacy, personal interest and the collective good, I think there are three things to note. The first is that these are not binaries. Privacy, national security, innovation, these are not binaries. We have always found a way to do these things without compromising on each other. We have to find that balance in our case. And I think the way in which this balance is found, as in has in history taken a threefold path. The first is what I would call as in the bolting of the horses, which is as in the with the digital ecosystem, the states generally allowed private players to innovate. And this was primarily the United States with a laissez-faire economy, which became the default norm for the rest of the world. We didn't have a data protection law. We still don't have a data protection law in the country today. So with a few exceptions here or there, and that was phase one, when the horses were bolting. Continuing with that equine analogy, as in phase two was reining them in, and I think you do see a bit of that happening currently, whereas in India, where you see that when there's an incident of lynching, as in you first say, let's look at intermediary liability rules, so you do see some kind of efforts by states to pull back the power. And I think we are heading to a third stage where the state realizes that we have to come to a steady gallop. And that's essentially where the state and the private sector must work together.
Since you are now, the committee's job is over, and now you are, like me, a commentator on the bill, do you think we have done better in terms of holding the fiduciary aspect of the private sector than of the state itself? Because state as a data owner, have we treated at par with how we would treat a private sector in this particular bill?
So I think we need to know where we came from. As in today, as is the law today, the reasonable security practices rules don't apply to the state at all. So there are no data protection obligations on the state whatsoever today. From that, I think we have taken a quantum leap to say that the law applies to everybody, but applies differently.
Applies differently, but applies to everybody. So that's a step forward, not necessarily the ideal state where you would want it to be. And I'm putting words in your mouth. Mr. Gopalakrishnan, sir, I think this brings that nicely to you, the motivations, the drivers, and do you think that this document has achieved the fundamental objectives of what the courts wanted, what the government wanted, and what the people wanted?
We need a disciplining effect. How anybody includes government at all levels, collects data, treats it, and processes it, stores it, disposes it. Now, this is a very, very earth-shaking step in that direction, because so far there's been nothing. So in that case, one of the prospective violators of privacy being government that at least will have a correcting effect. And all the other, it will also bring in a disciplining effect into the rest of the whole ecosystem, maybe big companies and small players and etc. So in which case, it's going to be a drastic change. The draft also proposes a year's time for everything to fall into place. There has to be a change in the way people perceive data. Not necessarily, that's why I think I would stress upon the fiduciary. Okay. So anybody, including government as a fiduciary, they got to treat it with responsibility and be accountable. That's the bottom line.
So let me ask you to delve a little deeper on this new responsibility the government assumes on itself, for itself. What happens at the federal level? When we federate this responsibility, the largest amount of data that is going to be produced in the near future will be not in English and will probably come from peri-urban and rural areas, the new data sets that are being created. What is the capacity of a DPA that has been envisaged and this architecture that is being implemented to actually serve that constituency of users and data wells or data owners?
Yeah, it's evolving, but what I wish to say is today if somebody is a prospective violator of privacy, there's nothing in place, where can you go and complain? So once you have a DPA, it will bring in a structure. Now, whether it needs to be at the district level or a state level or a federal level is a matter which can be resolved.
Coming to you. So you heard Arghya and you've heard General Hayden, you've heard the different drivers of the two different arrangements that we have in place. You're familiar with the California arrangement. You have the GDPR. So do we have 4 different Facebooks now?
Hopefully not. I think it's really important that people in India and people everywhere be able to communicate with each other and have a centralized platform. But I think this is the right time to have this discussion, and I think it's a critically important discussion to have because of how important data is to the economies, to people. And I think one of the big contributions of certainly the Sri Krishna report and the draft that the government has proposed is this idea of responsibility, the idea that organizations, whether it's Facebook or any organization that holds people's information, needs to act responsibly and needs to meet the highest levels of trust when it comes to holding people's information. And I think that's certainly an ethical imperative and certainly comes out of law as well. But it's really a business imperative too, because the reality is if people don't have confidence that their information on Facebook is being held in a responsible way, that they're in control of their information, they're not going to feel comfortable using our services. And so I think that's something that we think about every day, the amount of trust that people place in us and the amount of work that we have to continue to do to achieve and meet that trust. On the question that you're raising about fragmentation and sort of different laws in different places, I think it's inevitable that there are going to be different data protection laws in different places. And that's true because what's right for India and the privacy interests that Indians have is going to be different than what's happening in Europe or what's happening in the United States. I do think that what's emerging, and I think one of the contributions actually of the proposal that the government has put forward is to put some structure around this idea of the fiduciary, to put some structure around what it means to act with responsibility. And I think there are a number of principles that come out of that I do think are globally relevant and hopefully will inform not just the discussion here in India, but the global discussion. And I think about that in terms of how we have thought about these issues at Facebook and how we'll continue to do it. I mean, I think a big part of what the Sri Krishna committee report and the bill suggest is you have a right to expect that organizations will tell you if they're collecting information about you and be forthright about what they're doing. And certainly, we've had a data policy for a long time that's provided this information to people, but increasingly we need to do that in an inclusive way. One of the things that and this also came out of the Sri Krishna report, is it's almost a false choice to say we have to not have security if we want privacy, or we have to not have innovation if we want to have privacy. I think it requires all of us, whether it's government, civil society, companies, to work together to figure out how to do that. But I think if we're able to rationalize that and work hard, we can have digital growth, we can have empowerment, we can have security, and we can have privacy too. And I think that's a lot of what I hope this discussion will be about.
And you have any concerns regarding this data protection bill? Do you think there are a couple of areas, do you think further debate is required or thought is required that troubles you, worries you?
Sure. I mean, again, I think the overall approach to data protection in this bill is really constructive, and I think it builds on, it's sort of framed as a fourth...
Criticisms now. It's like a bromance now. It's all one panel and we are like all speaking the same. You'll do that, okay. But go ahead.
He'll take on criticisms too. I mean, I think a lot of it is around the details, right? So I mean, I think we have to think about these questions, you know, when it comes to localization, which is something that I know a lot of people have been talking about. It's a new concept, right? There aren't models that we know about for what that looks like, and I think understanding more of how to handle that is going to be really important. I think thinking about what the approach is for minors, which is something that has been discussed less. But I think
age of consent.
Yeah, age of consent is really important.
Where are we through this bill? Are we reining in? Because sometimes there is criticism that this government trying to now pull really hard. It's really trying to say that, you know, this is now completely uncharted waters, ungoverned spaces. My presence is not being felt. I need to now come in. So as someone who has been writing, critiquing, commenting, contributing to the process, where do you see we have reached in the last year or so?
We knew this problem was coming since 2009, 2010. We've taken that long to really recognize that there is a systematic approach that we need to adopt to actually rein this horse in. And there have been attempts before. There's the 2011 draft, there's the 2013 draft of a privacy law. It didn't come into force. And you know, in some senses you're a little regretful that that didn't happen, but I think earlier on we were discussing that maybe it was for the best, because it happened after, you know, after all of that. We didn't have a law. GDPR happened. India had its big data moment. We're in this big data moment right now. And we had the opportunity to create a truly unique law and a truly unique framework for India. And as I read through the Sri Krishna committee report, I thought that was what we were going to get, because they spoke about the fourth way. There's the US way, the European way, the Chinese way, and India was going to be the fourth way. And then there was this beautiful construct of the data fiduciary, which appeals in many ways to me, which is that any data controller needs to be a fiduciary of the data that data controller collects. I have a similar model, which I call the accountability model, which you can just transpose the words. It's fiduciary, it's accountability. But when I looked in, this is the big but to the members of the committee, when I looked into the actual draft bill, to my mind, other than changing the definition of controller to fiduciary, the concept of a fiduciary didn't go as far as it could have. I think we had the opportunity to take it really far and make people accountable without putting prescriptive restrictions on people. So today we've got a law which is GDPR style, where there's a lot of prescription. And prescription is hard. I don't think we all recognize how difficult the future is going to be.
Correct.
But there is this thing called consent fatigue. All of you suffer from it. Can you just put your hands up? How many have read the privacy policies of all the apps on the phone that you're currently looking at?
Zero. I can answer none of them.
There's got to be some lawyer in the room.
Oh,
Suhan has read.
Suhan has read.
Right. But Suhan, have you read all the privacy policies? There you go. Right? I'm a lawyer. I'm a privacy lawyer. I do this for a living, and I haven't read all the privacy policies that come up. And that's the privacy policy, which is the entry. After that, any new form of data collection, you've got to notify. Any change in the technology, you've got to notify. That's what's coming to us, because the new world that this law is coming up with is extremely prescriptive. And I think we had the opportunity to move away from that and create a less prescriptive model. The second concern I have is the point that you made on government. And I agree with both Mr. Gopal Krishnan and Orgo in that government, this didn't apply to government up until now. So it's good to see that there is a data protection provision that applies to government. But when you dig in a little more deeply, the penalties that the law applies to all data fiduciaries is in terms of a percentage of global turnover. Now this makes no difference to government. Because government's global turnover, I mean, if you think about it, is GDP or, you know, tax revenue. But, you know, that's like, if the government actually violates my privacy, we'll have to then pay itself with my taxpayer money. There's no way I can cut that for it to make sense. So the concern is, and it's a very difficult problem, because if you use a GDPR-style model where the penalties are percentage of turnover, you come up with these problems when you apply it against government, because that's just the wrong construct for government. And then the third point I'll make, once again, just the opportunity to innovate. I think there is a movement around the world on privacy by design. Build privacy into the design of your systems. It's something that GDPR has introduced. It's something that the draft law also introduces, in that it says these are one of the things that you have to do and should do. One of the cornerstones of that is anonymization or de-identification. And I think Mr. Gopalakrishnan spoke about that. And there is an exemption right at the beginning, Section 2 of the Act, which says that if it is anonymized data, this Act will not apply to you. And that's great, except the definition of anonymized data is permanently irreversible data. And it is actually impossible, in my limited non-technical knowledge, to ever categorically say that data has been permanently anonymized. So the concern that I have is, that there's a lot in the draft, in the report, that is fabulous. It is truly innovative, path-breaking thinking. I don't see enough of it reflected in the draft law. And instead, I think the draft law, by its over-dependence on a GDPR framework, is going to cause a lot of trouble for an economy like ours, which is only just getting used to the concept of data protection and privacy. So we have gone 0 to 120 in a Ferrari, and we haven't learned to drive yet.
There's also another criticism, that not only we have not learned how to drive, but we have also perhaps not reached the destination where we wanted to go. So this bill was meant to be something to serve privacy, something to serve the startups and innovators. Perhaps we have not moved enough in these two directions. We have made other forms of government and governance more effective, but certainly the startup sector has, you can hear murmurs, you can hear them complaining, both in terms of what the localization provisions do to opportunities, but also the compliance processes are pretty similar whether you are a small company or a big one. And in that sense, do you think there is still time to now discuss whether the principal aim of promoting a digital economy, creating these Indian startups that can build value out of data that we are producing in gigabytes, in tera and zettabytes, has that bill done enough on that?
So I think just on the points that I had mentioned earlier, a company like Facebook will deal with these challenges very easily. I mean, they have the resources, they've got the experience in multiple jurisdictions to put it crudely, throw money at the problem and build compliance into a country. I think smaller companies, and by that I don't even mean like complete startups, I mean slightly smaller companies, will struggle. This will be a gating condition for companies that are looking to come into the country for the first time. And we've got to consider whether, how difficult this is going to be. I think it's easy for Europe to ratchet up the protection from what they had before to GDPR. Because if you think about it, they built to GDPR over 30 years. We are going straight to GDPR. Our companies have no experience of this. I think if our companies comply with privacy, it's because they do it out of the goodness of their heart. I can't think of any other reason, because there's no legal obligation for them to do it. But to be honest, a lot of my clients actually take this as a deep ethical obligation. And if there's a privacy violation, they will come up and rectify it. So I think that challenge to companies is something we're only just going to realize. And just to very briefly touch on the localization issue, I think that's an extremely serious issue, and I don't know if it will actually solve what it is set out to solve. So I don't want to talk about any of the other things, because there are enough people writing about it. But if you think about a young startup in another country, and if that young take Slack, for example. I don't know how many of you use Slack, but we use Slack a lot. It's a great,
especially for an office management tool,
messaging service, right? Based out of the US, or it could be based out of Sweden, anywhere in the world. If they are thinking to extend their services to India, if there's a localization obligation, they will say, I would rather not extend to India because I'd have to put my servers there. Think about the innovation that we will be denied because we're putting obligations on foreign startups which are completely innocent, have no objective other than to expand their market. Think of how much they will have to reconsider expanding to India. And I think that's another consequence that we've got.
Great, let me come to all of you now. I am always a possibilist, and I believe that this bill opens up possibilities. And I think that's important for a country that sees itself as a potential and future digital giant. I think without having an Indian narrative, without having an Indian script, without having an Indian proposition on the table, it would be that much more difficult to attract people to our digital solutions. And I think this bill seeks to do that. Let's debate this over the next few months. Let's debate this in Parliament. Let's get this right. And as Rahul says, let's have a bill at the end of the day. And thank you for joining us for this afternoon's discussion. Please thank the panelists for their interventions.